Right, let's get going. Well, welcome everyone to this event on arms transfers and the crisis in Sudan. And while I do appreciate that this year has got off to a very chaotic start, I think it's important that we continue to keep our eye on what have been some of the world's most serious crises, and Sudan is regrettably one of those. Today, we will examine what arms control mechanisms, particularly the Arms Trade Treaty, can do to prevent the transfer of weapons to the warring parties in Sudan. Reports from the UN Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and indeed general public reporting make clear that weapons transferred to Sudan are being used to kill civilians and to carry out other atrocities. Over the next hour, we will explore the crisis in Sudan, how arms transfers are affecting the Sudanese population, the distinctive features of the arms trade to Sudan, and what can be done to prevent weapons from being supplied to the warring parties. I am delighted to be joined by a stellar lineup of speakers, and these are Ms. Mimidou Achakaba, who is a Control Arms board member, and amongst a list of distinguished titles, is the Executive Director at the Women's Right to Education program and is based in Nigeria. Mimidou will be making opening remarks on behalf of Control Arms. We will then turn to Mr. Jeffrey Duke, who is an African scholar in Peace, Security and Development at the African Leadership Centre, King's College of London. Jeffrey is from South Sudan and is a long-time member of Control Arms. Third will be Mr. Mike Lewis, who is a consultant on war crimes and weapons investigations. And last, and certainly not least, is Dr. Shahad Hamori, lecturer in international law and legal theory at the University of Kent. Without further introduction, let's get underway, and therefore I now have the pleasure to invite Mimidou to make opening remarks. Over to you, Mimidou.
Thank you so much, Hinewai, and Happy New Year to everyone. Once again, my name is Mimidou Achakba. I wish to first begin by warmly welcoming everyone here and wishing everyone all the best for what is happening, what is already shaping up to be a challenging year 2026. The war in Sudan has entered its third year, and this is marked by relentless and recurring atrocities. In November last year, 2025, a special session of the Human Rights Council was convened on the human rights situation in and around El Fasher, following reports of mass civilian killings, ethnically targeted executions, widespread sexual violence, including gang rape, and other grave abuses. Tragically, these horrors are not isolated incidents. They reflect a consistent and deeply entrenched pattern throughout this conflict. So, three defining and deeply troubling features of the Sudanese conflict stand out. The first is the brazen and systematic targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure in violation of international law. The second is the rhetorical commitment to the protection of civilians, marked by the performative opening and closing of border crossings to create the illusion of civilian access to aid. And the third, but not the least, is the opacity and impunity in arms transfers to belligerents. So during the Human Rights Council special session, Mr. Adam Adieng, the African Union's special envoy on the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, demanded an immediate and to the flow, an immediate end to the flow of weapons and fighters into Sudan. Noting that these transfers are directly contributing to the systematic targeting of specific identity groups and to the country's catastrophic humanitarian situation. The reality is stark. Weapons transferred to the warring parties in Sudan are being used to kill civilians. Sudan is in a crisis that demands sustained and urgent attention. From the arms control community, this means confronting urgently the ongoing supply of conventional weapons that is enabling these atrocities to continue. Halting these transfers will require coordinated collective action. As we have already begun this work. Last year, at the ATT working groups, we initiated discussions on arms transfers to Gaza, Myanmar, and Sudan. We must continue to use every available mechanism and forum to expose the reality on the ground and to amplify the voices and suffering of the Sudanese people. I look forward to today's discussion and to learning from our experts about concrete steps we can take to prevent arms transfers to the warring parties in Sudan. I thank them, the speakers in advance for sharing their expertise and experience on this critical and urgent issue. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Hinawe.
Thanks very much, Mimidu, for getting us underway. I now turn to Jeffrey, and for those of you who don't follow this situation so closely, Jeffrey's going to outline who are the warring parties in Sudan, what are the reasons behind this conflict, and what has been the impact so far on the Sudanese people. So, Jeffrey, if you are still there, and I'm very much hoping that you are, over to you.
All right. Do you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you perfectly.
Very good. So thanks for the opportunity to share in this webinar. I will briefly explain who is fighting and why the conflict erupted and what it is meant for the South Sudanese civilians and the neighboring countries. Now, the war is being fought by primarily two armed actors. On the one hand, it's the Sudan Armed Forces, known as the SAF. And on the other hand, it's the Rapid Support Forces, known as the RSF. Now, the Sudan Armed Forces are the regular national army of the Sudan. And since independence in 1956, the SAF has been one of the most powerful political institutions in the country, much as it is formerly, the formal army of the state. The country has spent most of its post-independence history under military rule that has been in the last segment before the transition was under President Omar al-Bashir. And senior SAF leaders have been seen intertwined with the political economy of the country, overseeing state-owned companies, control land and businesses, and repeatedly intervene in civilian politics. So they have enormous influence in the politics of the country. Now, following the removal of Bashir, the South presented itself as the guarantor of the state sovereignty to take the country forward through a transition to civilian, democratic civilian regime. And that is part of the challenge, that power moved from the military to the military, with the South holding the one end of the equation. On the other hand, the Rapid Support Forces are very different in origin. They grew up out of a group called the Janjaweed militias. If you remember, the war in Darfur in the early 2000s, these militias were mobilized by the South Sudanese state during that conflict period in Darfur, and they have been implicated for mass atrocities against civilians, and some of them were actually named by the ICC for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and etc. Now, this group, instead of being dismantled, later on, they were formalized under the South Sudanese security, organs, and they were renamed as the Rapid Support Forces and given legal status, weapons, and funding by the state. So over time, the RSF became a very powerful paramilitary force with its own command structure, its own resources, and notably from gold mining and maintaining strong autonomy from civilian oversight. Now, in short, Sudan entered the post-2019 Bashir period with two heavily armed forces operating in parallel, both deeply embedded in the politics and the economy of the country. So those are the two armed groups that are fighting, that are leading the fight in Sudan. Now, the current fighting began in April 2023, but its roots go much deeper. So after decades of authoritarian rule, Sudanese civilians forced the removal of President Omar Hassan in 2019, and they demanded a democratic transition. However, instead of dismantling this militarized system of power was largely negotiated between these two groups, the SAF on the one hand and the RSF on the other. They became partners in managing this transition, whilst the civilians have been gradually sidelined, even if they were the forces that led the overthrow of Bashir. Now, the immediate trigger of the war was a dispute over security sector reform, specifically whether the RSF would be integrated into the SAF as the national army, or they would maintain some kind of a semi-autonomous command. And on what timeline would this integration happen? But this was really not about integration, but who would control the Sudanese state following the overthrow of Bashir. So that dispute escalated, into direct confrontation between the two forces, and it led to the collapse of the power sharing agreement that was established, that included the armed forces and some components of the civilians that led the uprising, leading to the removal of Bashir. So basically, at the deeper level, we can trace the conflict to decades of militarized governance, where the soldier is also the state and civilians have been excluded from core decisions of the state. And then the second is a failed political transition following the fall of al-Bashir, and a political economy in which armed actors control resources such as gold, land, and trade routes, and this allows them to finance war independently of the state. Now, moving on to what has been the impact, many of you might have seen, Mimido has highlighted some aspects of the impact of the war and why it matters to not only regional stability and security, but to international dynamics and security beyond the immediate borders of Sudan. Now, what you might be able to remember is that Sudan is currently experiencing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, with over 12 million people who have been displaced, making it the largest displacement crisis in the recent history. More than 20 million people face acute food insecurity. OCHA have you know, given warning of famine conditions that have been reported in several parts of the country. Women and children, especially most affected, facing hunger, displacement, and widespread sexual and gender-based violence. These have been well documented. And one important thing to note in this crisis is that civilians are not necessarily caught in the crossfire. They have been deliberately targeted. And this has been properly documented, including by the ICRC, the international, fact-finding mission on the Sudan. These, some people try to attribute it to one side, but the RSF has been implicated in mass killings, accusations of ethnic cleansing, and systematic sexual violence, particularly in Darfur. And the SAF, on the other hand, have been accused of carrying out indiscriminate airstrikes in densely populated areas. And these are not mere accusations, but well documented. Now, I will finally conclude this segment by saying that the war that has started in Sudan has not stayed within its borders. More than 3.5 million Sudanese refugees have fled into neighboring countries such as South Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, and etc. And these countries already have their own economic and security hardships, further complicating, the fragility in these countries, because Sudan is not necessarily a country surrounded by stable states, but rather fragile conditions. Now, arms trafficking is one of the significant elements of this crisis. Smuggling networks linked to the war are spreading into Sahel and beyond the Horn of Africa, reinforcing regional conflict economies. For example, arms spilling from Sudan into South Sudan is already undermining the Security Council arms embargo on Sudan and threatening the very fragile peace in South Sudan. And instability in Sudan also poses risk to Red Sea corridor security, which is vital for global trade and energy supplies internationally, especially in the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes regions. For these reasons, Sudan is not just a national tragedy, but it's both a regional and international security concern that demands that arms that are fueling the conditions needs to be brought under control. I will stop there for now. Thank you.
You're muted.
Thanks. And still alive, fall for that trickle, that trap all over again. Now, I wanted to say, Jeffrey, thanks very much for so very clearly laying out the background to what is happening in Sudan and the context that is confronted today. Now, we'll now turn to Mike and Shahad to discuss the challenges of addressing arms transfers to Sudan and the steps that could be taken to prevent them. The Arms Trade Treaty, whose negotiation Control Arms helped to bring about, was established to prevent the human suffering caused by irresponsible arms transfers. Given that atrocities are being committed by all parties to the conflict, including government armed forces and armed groups, it is difficult to understand how any state could justify transferring weapons to Sudan. Yet some arms trade treaty states parties have been implicated in such transfers. It should also be noted that some of the most significant arms transfers to Sudan have been carried out by states that are not party to the ATT. So this is a further challenge that we need to address. With this background, I will now turn to Mike. Mike is a former sanctions expert on Sudan. What are the distinctive features of the arms trade to the warring parties in Sudan? Have the UN Security Council and EU sanctions had an impact on preventing the transfer of weapons? And if not, why is this the case? And what can states do to prevent arms from being transferred to Sudan? Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, in a way, and thank you to Mamadou also for the invitation to speak on these matters. Well, look, I think, Sudan is to some degree a kind of object lesson in the ability of the international community, such that it is, to design what look like plausible measures to try to stop weapons reaching those perpetrating atrocities that are almost entirely inoperative. The kind of sort of original sin of the efforts, particularly by the UN Security Council, to control weapons going to conflict activists in Sudan, is the fiction perpetrated since 2005 that you can impose an arms embargo on part of a country where the sovereign government of that country is also a party to the conflict, and expect that that subnational arms embargo to have some kind of effect. So this experiment since 2005 of having a geographically partial UN arms embargo on Sudan has, I think, it's fairly clear, been an almost total failure since 2005, and that's been well documented by 20 years now of reporting by UN Security Council arms monitors. And then on the other side, there are a number of regional groupings that have imposed a full arms embargo on the whole of the territory of Sudan, and indeed South Sudan when it was part of Sudan prior to 2011. So the European Union since 1994, but also other states, including Canada, the USA, Australia, and others. But obviously, that supply side embargo, that restraining supply side embargo, has only ever been geographically partial and covering, and it doesn't include a number of historically absolutely key suppliers, both to the various governments in Sudan and to the regional countries that have also facilitated arms transfers into Sudan over the years. So at both ends, at the supply end and at the destination end, you have geographically partial embargoes that, essentially were designed for failure from the start. What's obviously changed since those measures were imposed in the 1990s and then in 2005 by the UN Security Council, obviously, is that fighting has expanded right across many other parts of Sudan since 2023. And there's also, as Hinaway said, there's also been the imposition of the International Arms Trade Treaty since certainly since the war in Darfur started in the early 2000s. And I think what characterizes the supplies to all sides of the conflict at the moment in Sudan is that direct supplies to the warring parties are substantially undertaken by external, mainly state sponsors, who are mostly not state parties to the Arms Trade Treaty or to regional agreements like the EU arms embargo on Sudan. That's not to say, as Hinaway said, that countries that do subscribe to the Arms Trade Treaty or to regionally imposed embargoes on Sudan don't find their weapons ending up in Sudan. But they do so via intermediate suppliers to the warring parties in Sudan that are not bound by those regional agreements or by the Arms Trade Treaty. And so I think what the other sort of great lesson to be drawn from the arrival of weapons on all sides in Sudan is that the risk assessment, both of the requirement to risk assess the potential of arms diversion in the Arms Trade Treaty and in regional agreements, and the requirement to risk assess the possibility that weapons exported to a particular destination might have an overriding risk of being used in various forms of international crimes in Article 7 of the ATT. Those risk assessment procedures either aren't being applied by certain Arms Trade Treaty member states, or they are simply the fact of a risk assessment without a definition of what that risk assessment should entail essentially allows states to say they've conducted a risk assessment while not actually conducting conducting an assessment that might actually constrain their export behavior. So I think those two big lessons are what I draw from Sudan. One, the fact that embargoes can't work if they are regionally partial, either at the supply or the destination end. And secondly, the risk assessment standards in the ATT or in regional agreements simply aren't working. I don't know if it's useful in a way to say something about the problem of getting information about arms transfers to Sudan, or you want to leave that for another part of the discussion?
No, Mike. Let's have it now, because this isn't a characteristic of the trade to Sudan.
Sure. Well, look, I think one important thing to say about Sudan is that obviously it's because there is a UN arms embargo, there is a UN Security Council body that is set up, a committee set up to monitor arms flows in violation of the UN arms embargo at least into the western states of Darfur. And as I said, that body has been reporting the near total failure of UN arms controls on Sudan for about 20 years. And what that continuous reporting of failure also underlines is the fact that the UN Security Council really hasn't been able to agree on imposing serious repercussions for any of the intermediate parties that have been responsible in various ways for moving those weapons, providing logistics, providing financing, and so on. And the sanctions list imposed by the UN Security Council on Sudan is extremely small and has always been extremely difficult to expand. And I think because there is that UN monitoring body, I think many member states have over-relied upon that body to say what is happening in terms of arms transfers particularly into Darfur. And so, I think a lot of exporting states have kind of outsourced their responsibility for checking that weapons they export are not ending up in Sudan, have kind of outsourced that to the reporting of the UN panel of experts on Sudan. And there's a very good example of that. I think the very well publicized incident in November of 2024 in North Darfur in a place called Jebel Redi. So between the North Darfur capital of Al-Fashir and the border with Libya, much further north, an arms shipment on a set of land cruisers was intercepted by what are called the joint forces. So these are armed groups at the moment allied to the Sudanese Armed Forces. They were intercepted from this convoy, which was moving both fighters and weapons for the rapid support forces. And on the one hand, what you see is exactly so they captured mercenary fighters. They captured a number of crates of munitions manufactured in both inside and outside the European Union, that had been supplied to another state party that was supporting one side of the armed conflict. So on the one hand, you see a number of actors supplying weapons directly to parties to the conflict in Sudan who are not bound by the ATT. They can argue that they're not supplying directly into Darfur, so they're not bound by the UN arms embargo on Darfur. And so it looks like the problem is that what we talked about, these geographically partial extent of arms embargoes at the supply and the destination end. But if you look at what was being supplied, both in terms of mercenary fighters and in terms of weapons, what you see are, mercenary fighters from a South American country, for example, being recruited via companies registered in South America, in Central America, in the Middle East, also in Europe, it seems quite recently. You have munitions being manufactured, as I said, both inside and outside the European Union by states who are state parties to the Arms Trade Treaty and also to the EU embargo on Sudan, who, in exporting those weapons and those munitions to a supplier to the conflict in Sudan, have ignored that supplier's decade-long history of diverting weapons to UN embargoed actors right across Africa and the Middle East. That's been very well documented by that UN Security Council arms monitors in a number of different embargoed countries. So what you have, therefore, is what looks like the failure of a regionally partial embargo is actually the failure of risk assessment about diversion of the kind required by Article 11 of the Arms Trade Treaty.
Yeah, Mike, thanks very much. It is a very sobering picture that you outline, and rightly so when it's been such an extensive background of very little happening. And I entirely agree with you, unfortunately, that states just have outsourced to the Security Council mechanism without actually questioning, is this mechanism having an impact? And then states at the same time complain that multilateralism itself is not having an impact, and yet they're the ones who can make this happen or not. On the ATT risk assessment, you make a good point. This is either a case of the risk assessment not being applied or being applied in such a lax fashion that end user certificates are accepted in the face of widespread report, extensive reporting on the atrocities being committed in Sudan. And states, ATT states parties know very well that if the treaty is to be seen as being credible, it must have an impact, and that requires states parties to, at the time of deciding to transfer weapons, to take a preventative approach and to act on the basis of information that is known and is available to them. And it also requires taking a comprehensive approach, and if the objectives of the ATT are to be met, to be considering the issue of re-export. So, you raise a number of key points really for ATT states parties. But Shahad, over to you now, and I'd be interested if there's anything that you immediately want to respond to that Mike has set out, and whether you see any additional challenges concerning the preventing and monitoring the transfers of arms to Sudan, and the dynamics surrounding this context. And where do you think states, international organizations, and especially civil society should focus their efforts?
Thank you so much for the invitation and for also initiating this discussion. It is indeed a very heavy-hearted one, especially in the fact that a lot of what's happening on the ground is not something that we are very much well aware of, in the absence of good internet connection and in the absence of reporting by mainstream media. It is very clear that at the core of the problem here is a really never-ending expansion of the military industry on a global level, and under the current dominating economic geopolitical system. And the background of what happened in Sudan really builds a lot on an absence of real and dynamic consideration of Sudanese self-determination, fluctuations in the price of oil brought about by big oil, as well as very bad decision-making by the IMF. As we start, this is a very particular context, as noted by my colleagues thus far. First of all, the supply comes from primarily second-tier actors in the global arms trade. So they're big on import, not big on production. Some of them, of course, not all of them. So here we're looking at Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. So the arms trade offers them a maintenance for an unequal economic expansion, so to speak. So it offers them a space where they can also engage in the larger military industry, as noted by a lot of economists on the matter. Meanwhile, there is a strong supply coming in from China and Russia in a shifting terrain where US unipolarity is being challenged. While weapons diversion is occurring via unstable states with weak governance and accountability, as well as weak economic situations themselves. Lastly, the majority of the transfer and the finance is happening through informal war economies, which would make it very hard to trace, but also very hard to intervene in a manner that would protect the Sudanese people. So, when taking those particularities into consideration, we have to have an approach to the designing of the tactics to support the Sudanese people that takes this into consideration. So, as noted by Mike, in this case, the sanctions have proven to be quite ill-suited via the Security Council, especially when they're only regional. Even if they are towards the whole of the state, there would still be serious difficulties in implementing them, and there is. They might, unless we have a very concrete capacity to study how such sanctions would facilitate the shifting into an informal economy, and how is it that we'd be able to react to that, because sanctions tend to reshift, let's say, the dynamics of the informal war economy. The question of whether or not having a resolution by the UN General Assembly to that end could be something good in at least shedding further light on the subject matter, as well as harnessing state support and stress in relation to that. And there is a movement towards trying to harness more power in the General Assembly with the shifting power dynamics globally. Meanwhile, under the ATT, we only have China and Serbia who are signatories to the ATT Convention and in direct violation of their obligations under the ATT. So these two states are clearly in violation of Article 6 and 7. They are supplying to a state that is clearly, both sides are in violation of their duties. If anything, an embargo on the whole state of any supply of weaponry into that state is an important factor. Meanwhile, all the other actors, Russia, Turkey, UAE, Egypt, Yemen, Belarus, are not suppliers. While we are looking, however, there are major ATT state members who are selling to the states that are supplying. So we can keep that in mind in the sense of the, as noted by Mike, end user certificates, and further calls for advocacy and diplomatic pressure to demand the review of the relations, transparency, as well as end user certificates. Here we're looking at the US, France, Germany, Italy, UK, Spain, South Korea, Sweden, and Norway. So that's quite a lot of jurisdictions where such work can be taken forward. Meanwhile, it's notable that both Chad and the Central African Republic are transfer states. So there, in those states, we can focus more in relation to their duty as states that are channeling. As also noted by Mike, there is a strong need for further research and an absence of information. So further and deeper connection with people on the ground would really allow us to better understand this. And I think there's a lot of more work to be done with local mutual aids, as well as local civil society actors who are trying to make themselves heard. Other avenues that require creativity at this point and that have been tried in other contexts. First of all, research demonstrates that there's corporate complicity, for example, through private military contractors supplying on the ground. As for example, there is Zeus Global that has headquarters or offices at least in United Kingdom, pushing for heightened corporate due diligence in supply chains of gold, oil, logistics, telecom, and defense. And notably, and here we're looking at one important supply chain, which is the Arabic gum supply chains. Big corporations like Coca-Cola and Pepsi might have relations to that and further scrutiny. And it's important. Why I'm speaking about those commodities is that they're directly being sold by the warring parties. So any money being sold from there directly goes to the finance of buying the weapons. And then, of course, there's the questions in relation to Starlink's involvement. So other things that we could consider are targeted sanctions on the enablers themselves, as well as their own financing. That has been quite an important tool in other contexts. Global audits on gold flows are essential in this case. So resolutions on that end could be very monumental in approaching this conflict. And I know this is not usual. However, some Sudanese commentators have noted that currency stabilization, as well as efforts through central banks, such as the African Development Banks, could be useful in also navigating how the currency fluctuations that the rapid that the two armed forces are handling, as well as stabilizing access to money for people on the ground trying to get to aid. So, adding to that, the effects of this war economy, not only, of course, are we undoing the whole of this is the whole of the Sudanese economic infrastructure, revitalizing important smuggling routes via Libya, Chad, and South Sudan. More weapons are feeding into local economies, as Jeffrey has noted, and the growth in private military contracting markets through the proceeds. So it's very important also when we are approaching this case is that not only to call for a ceasefire, but to tackle this war economy. And sadly enough, we haven't seen a lot of movement by the African Union in this. There's been condemnation, but not much more has gone beyond this. A lot of questions in relation to their power in taking things forward, as well as their weak enforcement capacity. So supporting regional actors as well as regional organizations could be useful in helping, giving them more leverage, let's say, in approaching this, and inevitably limiting the amount of weaponry going into Sudan and engaging with it. In conclusion, this is indeed a very complex situation. The very sad thing is that there hasn't been concrete international community response to it. And this is an opportunity for us to actually scale up as much as possible. The first step happens in knowledge and in understanding better this war economy, and then harnessing diplomatic and advocacy spaces as much as we can and as creatively as we can to respond to the particularities of this war economy.
Yeah, thanks very much, Shahad, and really a big thanks for fleshing out some ideas, and especially on this issue of the war economy and how the support for this conflict continues, and also for some of the other ideas, and making the point that more research and deeper connections with those on the ground is needed. I don't know if it's so much a scaling up or what is needed on Sudan is a reset, and really for UN member states and the international community as a whole to take greater ownership and responsibility for what is happening in Sudan. But certainly much more effort is needed. Now, we do have some questions, and I want to get to these quite quickly. We've answered really the first question about ATT states parties that are transferring weapons to this issue. They are either not applying the ATT risk assessment or not applying it in any rigorous type of fashion. And this needs to be called out, and really serious discussions had with such ATT states parties to demonstrate that this treaty is credible and to keep it on track. Sam Perlow Freeman asks a question about what would be the impact if the UAE was to withdraw its support for the RSF, and what else can be done to bring pressure on the UAE. So I'd be grateful if one of the speakers could volunteer to answer that question. James has said that there are reports that Kenya has been involved in illegal arms transfers into Sudan, including investigative media reports of ammunition originating from Kenya. Is this something that any of the speakers knows about? And do we have one? Any embargo or sanctions need a mechanism or force to apply it. So this is one of the problems that we're discussing about Sudan, is that there hasn't been reinforcement of the sanctions, and the sanctions have limited geographical application. So on this question of the UAE and then Kenya, do I have a volunteer, or should I nominate someone myself? Shahad, you first.
If Mike wants to go, I'm happy. Well, very quickly, they're not extensive answers. With the UAE, indeed, if they would withdraw their support, we would have and of course, in this case, it would be one party winning over the other. It wouldn't be a structural response. But the most important thing is that it would just stop the inflation of money going into the conflict, as well as hard currency through the gold. So it's and there's research by Chatham House, as well as a lot of other places that really bring out really stark numbers. And also, let's note that the price of gold has gone up tremendously in the past 2 years with Gaza and Ukraine. So we are talking about immense amounts of profit, as well as insane amounts of prosecution for anyone speaking about this. So there is a little bit of pressure in the UK at the moment in relation to that, as far as my knowledge goes, but that has remained quite very minimal, and I would argue not quite creative in the approach, because no state wants to at the moment bother the UAE for very clear reasons. That would take another panel to discuss. However, in theory, yes, Sam. And as to Kenya, as far my knowledge is that I know that it's there, but also my knowledge is that Kenya is not a signatory to the ATT. I'm happy to be corrected if that's wrong information. Maybe Mike would know better.
No, Kenya isn't an ATT state party yet. But Mike.
Well, look, maybe we can take a couple of these together, because a number of them are essentially about state sponsors of illicit weapons transfers. And I think there has been, I think when exporting countries come to assess diversion risks and risks of arms entering the illicit sphere, I think there has been a serious and I think quite willful misunderstanding about what most illicit arms transfers look like, particularly in the East African region, but also more widely. And I think that misperception has not been helped by the sort of bracketing of illicit arms transfers or arms diversion in various instruments and fora as being part of transnational organized crime. Of course, that is the case in some countries, and there are private and criminal actors involved. But I have to say, I have spent over 20 years of my career looking at weapons that have ended up in places they shouldn't have done. And I've seen dozens and dozens of end user certificates, for example, issued for those weapons that have ended up in places where they shouldn't have done. I think of those dozens and dozens of EUCs that I've seen, I think perhaps one or possibly two I've ever seen across 20 years have been fake. That's to say, actually just, fabricated. In all the other cases, they have been officially issued by governments, but in most cases with the knowledge of parties within those governments that the weapons are going elsewhere. And so we have to grapple with the reality that a very large proportion of illicit arms transfers are sponsored by states who have the right to buy weapons themselves. And I speak often to arms control officials and export control officials inside and outside the European Union, for example, many of whom continue to say things like, oh, well, this request for an export came with a legitimate end user certificate, we verified that it was authentically issued by a government, and therefore we have to issue the export license. That's if we take that attitude, if we believe that all sovereign governments are not complicit in illicit arms transfers, and therefore if there is a genuine EUC involved in an arms transfer, then it can't be a diversion risk. If we continue to take that if states continue to peddle that fiction, we will never have decent diversion risk assessment. And then just allied to that, and there are many EU states as well as non-EU states who are as guilty of that, willfully or not. Just allied to that, the question of whether if we knocked out one supplier to the conflict, would it end the conflict? There's no doubt, as Shahad said, that there are certain state suppliers to the conflict that particularly are providing strategically important weapon systems, especially, of course, in the drone war, which characterizes quite a lot of the fighting since 2023. All of that having been so certainly the ability of the parties, especially to project force right across the country from one side to the other, is absolutely critical and relies upon certain state suppliers. And when you've got the situation of a kind of semi-divided country where you've got one party to the conflict holding large amounts of territory in the west, another in the east, the ability to transfer force across one side to the other is absolutely critical. All of that having been said, I think we quite often have, particularly in the Sudan conflict, but in other conflicts as well, we have the kind of illusion of information because of all of the videos that we see being posted on TikTok, because of the fact that these are to some degree social media wars, thanks, as Shahad said, to quite geographically selective, but nonetheless very widely used Starlink connections and so on. And I think that illusion of information, all of the online social media images and evidence we see about weapons ending up in the conflict theater prioritizes and skews us towards these kinds of charismatic weapon systems, particularly long-range drones. And what we don't see are all the kind of bread and butter small arms and munitions that are used day to day in a conflict that are not being dismantled systematically online, and we can't see it. And therefore, that's why serious field research continues to be absolutely critical by the UN panel of experts and others. Obviously, field access to different parts of Sudan to look at weapons, for example, has been
I think Mike has cut out. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but and he's actually gone offline. But what I must say is his statement about end user certificates I found truly devastating. That only two end user certificates he has come across have been fakes, and the rest have been backed by government officials. And I guess, there are various questions that, arise. Should at the ATT we be having a discussion about the role of end user certificates and exactly how credible are they, as well as a discussion about the responsibilities of a signatory state such as the UAE to the ATT and transfers to that country. So unfortunately, it does appear that Mike really has dropped off and is not doesn't seem to be returning. But Shahad, I wanted to ask you, there is a question about private sector actors. Have you sensed any is there awareness amongst the private sector that they shouldn't, that they either should be very careful or shouldn't be operating in Sudan? And do you think more could be done in this area?
Absolutely. In terms of what is ending up with big corporations. So what we're looking at specifically here are oil, gold, and the Arabic gum. Those are the main three, let's say, as far as my knowledge goes, that we should be quite, and of course, defense and weapons parts. So companies that are big suppliers at this end, heightened due diligence, as well as audits, would be very important. And indeed, private military contractors, contracting companies, functioning in and around Sudan, as well as the neighboring states. That's where we should keep an eye on. So perhaps this is another tactic to be followed, which is through investor advice and within the guidance given in heightened due diligence, to keep in mind that this is something to flag. And I'm aware that so far, there's been very little work in relation to that, in relation to understanding how these flows would end, and also with international companies buying gold. I think the amount of gold that has been invested into the community now, into the international community, is quite big, and we still don't have a like gold is one of those industries that really have very little supply chain rigor to them. So taking the business and human rights guidance further in these sectors, I think, simply said. And I
Yeah.
think we have Mike back as well.
Hey, Shahad, just a question on that. There seems to have been a big focus on tracing diamonds and ensuring that people want to ensure that they are buying ethical diamonds. Is it just not possible to try and take the same approach to gold?
Well, the diamond approach has been quite difficult with the Fowler report and then the
Yeah.
auditing around it and everything. And it's not that anyone sees that as a as a success story incomplete. However, you're correct in the fact that market perceptions, let's say, in terms of ethical consumption, and as well as ensuring that your diamonds are not blood diamonds, has reached, and that was a lot of work for decades in order to bring forward and counter, so to speak, the culture that big companies like De Beers entrenched, which is the normalization of blood diamonds. And I agree with you that that could be something to consider. However, one thing to note is that the gold industry is not as centralized as the diamond industry was, because it's much older. So that would be a much bigger challenge, so to
Yeah.
speak. But companies that do that then can use that to say that, well, we ensure to you that ours is ethically sourced, and that could be something that then could build, let's say, consumer attitudes towards gold. And I think, personally speaking, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Hey, well, there is clearly much to consider from this discussion. Thanks very much to our speakers. We are on the way to wrapping up, so we've changed the order of how we were going to proceed. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to give it to Mike and then Shahad to briefly say what they think ATT states parties should focus on at the working groups in March if they want to help the people of Sudan. And then I'm going to turn to Jeffrey for the final word. Mike, before you dropped out, one thing I must say is your comments about end user certificates were devastating. And I think we do need a discussion at the ATT about end user certificates, amongst many other issues. But looking ahead to the ATT working groups in March, what would you say are some of the most urgent issues that ATT states parties should focus on?
Yeah, three things really quickly. One is two related to ATT and two kind of, and one aligned to it. Clearly, states with a willingness to want to prevent arms supplies to Sudan, they need to pay. They need to get the diversion risk assessment obligation that's working properly, whether that's typically which changes the fundamental effects of the treaty or elaborating serious standard criteria for those risk assessments. That's one thing. The second is being serious about components. Obviously, there's quite a lot of
Okay, thanks very much. So that was being serious, taking seriously
confusion over exactly what parts and components are controlled by the ATT and how they're controlled under the parts and components provisions. But preventing parts and components getting in those supply chains is really critical. And then the third thing is, not directly to do with the ATT, but if there are state parties that really want to seriously interdict and constrain the supply chains of weapons into Sudan, they have to make sure that the sanctions that they're imposing that target facilitators, financiers, logistics providers for weapon supplies into Sudan, that those sanctions are universalized and that they are complete. That's to say, so a classic example is that the US State Department and the Treasury just before Christmas sanctioned a number of companies allegedly involved in supplying mercenary fighters to one side of the conflict. And as Shahad mentioned, I sit here in the UK, 3 miles away from a company set up by those individuals who were sanctioned that is still active in the UK company registry, that because the UK didn't mirror those sanctions, and also that those sanctions didn't spot this very easily spottable company set up by the individuals who've been sanctioned, so that that company doesn't appear on the sanctions lists. So universalizing and making sure that they are comprehensive is really important.
Yeah,
that's all I've got.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mike. Well, the ATT has established a diversion information exchange forum, and there really has to be some questions raised about how the risk of diversion is being raised. And one of the topics on the ATT's agenda for March is the issue of parts and components, and clearly there is much to discuss there. Now, Shahad, what would be I'm sure you would have many messages for ATT states parties, but in terms of the urgent issues related to Sudan, what would you like to see them address?
Well, to be honest, quite very much keen to Mike in relation to end user certificates, as well as a note on the transfers and due diligence in relation to how things are going, because that's let's say for us the focal point at the moment to ensure that there is no proliferation. Another thing is, of course, going back to since we're looking at the drone war now, going back to the issue of regulating or discussing an abstract level the use of new technologies as well and their trade, which is something that hasn't been quite the strong focus thus far. However, these are the two things that would come to my mind directly.
Thanks very much, Shahad. And now to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, what would be your final message to ATT states parties? And do you have any hope that this conflict is going to come to an end? Jeffrey, over to you.
Well, I do have a hope that this conflict will come to an end. However, unfortunately, it doesn't look very near because of what we're talking about here, the constant fueling of the crisis through arms transfers. Unless we cut down the fuel that is behind these crises, we are not going to see any, end to the crisis in sight. Well, we might say that we need a political solution to this. Yeah, I fully agree. But the thing is, if arms continue to flow into the country, the incentives for the two armed groups to gravitate towards a political solution remains insignificant. And one other thing that I would like to underscore is that the humanitarian crisis, that while working to cut down arms supplies to Sudan, let's also appreciate the real current challenges that lives of millions of Sudanese civilians depend on humanitarian aid, and that while ATT member states are also trying to curb supplies, they should not forget funding the humanitarian appeal to address the very everyday existential threat that are facing millions of Sudanese. And how to address that is, among others, by looking at what is already working. There are several volunteer groups, emergency response groups, the mutual aid support groups that are saving lives and making a huge impact, even compared to some international organizations, when we put it in the context of how much is being. So direct support to these mutual aid groups is very necessary on one hand, while on the other hand, ensuring that the countries whose arms are found in Sudan are named and shamed, and non-signatory states can be reached out through other bilateral or multilateral mechanisms, although not directly within the framework of the ATT. It's possible using the evidence that has been established by the funding mission. Countries can be called out that your arms are fueling an active crisis in Sudan. So at least if that is happening, we'll see the cost of arms supplies is reduced, and hopefully arms flows will also be reduced. And I also stress the importance of insisting on arms embargo, because it gives the framework for even the investigators to be able to go to Sudan and collect data on what kind of arms are fueling crisis, because we know the challenge of access to information without international frameworks. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeffrey. And I think, you really set out an important reminder about the importance of humanitarian assistance at this moment to the people of Sudan, and that it's really going to be for local people on the ground to carry on, and that humanitarian efforts are currently facing unprecedented challenges, which was only underlined last week when I think it was over the past 2 weeks, the United States announced that this year they would be giving $2 billion to humanitarian assistance, whereas in the past they have given $14 billion. So there really are some terrible challenges that are coming the way of the Sudanese people. I really, again, want to thank Mimidou, Jeffrey, Mike, and Shahad. What has been a very short hour has reminded me all over again that so much more and that we need to do so much more on Sudan to raise attention to what is happening there and who is making this possible. And it's clear that if the Arms Trade Treaty, if it is to be a credible forum, it has to address this issue, which really is one of the most pressing issues and is regularly cited as being one of the world's top 10 humanitarian crises. So thanks very much to everybody in the audience for joining us and for listening in, and for what have been some excellent questions. And thanks once again to our experts. Well, I certainly hope that we have the opportunity to collaborate again in the future. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.